Welcome back. Respectful communication and conflict navigation. Working on a prototyped course and fully decided on the name, looking at different modules. And I've got a couple of other videos I posted. One is a overall run through of the model I'm thinking through for systems thinking and respectful communication, and then some shorter videos on each of the particular components. And so if you're first coming to this, ultimately this is looking at a self at the core, surrounded by others, family, friends, colleagues. Those are nested within systems such as institutions and organizations, and then the larger outside circle of structures such as legislation, laws, constitutions, and countries. And all of those are surrounded within the continuum of time and history because things change over time. And so in two previous videos, I talked about the big outer circle of structures and started there, looking at the impact of constitutions, things like citizenship and the laws of the country and otherwise, then moved down into systems, and then now looking at others. And so in the others, this is the people we interact with on a daily basis, our family, friends, colleagues, neighbors, community members, random folks at the grocery store. Others is a big part, and this is where we're into the heart of interpersonal communication, me and you, or us and them, the interactions that we have with other people on a daily basis, inter meaning in between. And key and foundational to this is perceptions. Similarly, any of these components around perceptions and our perceptions of others and others' perceptions of us can apply to the intrapersonal, to the inside, to the self. Perceptions of ourselves are also critical, and being aware of those as we're trying to communicate with others and communicating with others. And so this video breaks down some components of perception, and there's lots more in thinking through others, and it's probably where the basis of most courses, if you've taken any on interpersonal communication, the self and the others is probably where most of those focus. And so in the perception process, there's sort of four steps that occur. We have information coming in, just an amazing amount of information that our brain will absorb and take in, and we have to select certain components out of that. So we select information using all five of our senses. That's a key part of it. So step one is selecting the information, and then two is organizing it. And we organize that information based on a variety of things, experiences, socialization, the relationship or the context with the people that were in, the language. But also really critical to this is what I talked about in the two previous videos, is the systems, the institutions, and the structures that influence ourselves and the people that we're dealing with as well, because these can have a big impact on our identities. They can have a big impact on our personalities. So those are all really critical. So we select information, we organize it, and then we interpret it. And similar to above, there's a big influence of families that we were raised in, potentially religion, another type of institution, maybe the education system, the communities we've lived in, or maybe we've lived in many communities. And key within that interpreting information is the narratives. So I have a narrative, you have a narrative, there's different narratives included in this. And then within that process is then negotiating that information. So that's the fourth step. We select it, we organize it, we interpret it, and then we begin a negotiation process. And communication, by its root meaning in English, means to try and make things common and define commonality and common ground. Not necessarily agree, but common ground. And we do that all the time in our households and with our families and with our friends, trying to find common ground. Should we eat here? Or should we meet there? Go for a walk there? That's really at the heart of communication. So those are the four steps, and it's generalizing in many ways. Select, organize, interpret, and then begin to negotiate, and we create that shared meaning and that shared narrative. And when we share narratives, say in a marriage or in a family, it can often make communication a bit smoother. It's often where conflict comes from as well. So there's four main components that influence our perceptions, and there's no real clear distinct lines between all of these. It can be quite intermingled. There's the physiological influences on perception. So these are, like I was mentioning, all five senses. Some of them are more dominant than others, and it also depends on the certain use of things. I've mentioned it in another video. I only hear in one ear. I'm deaf in my left ear, and that influences how I hear things, literally. Then others may not have full sight or limited sight or no sight, and so they may use different senses, and others smell, taste, and touch. All of those are critical components. And then within the physiological components, within the senses, there's different impacts on that. Age, generations, health, so things like sleep, whether we're hungry or not, whether certain biological cycles are influencing us. Think about folks that work shift work, for example. They do some nights 12 hours and then do some days 12 hours, and that can have a big impact on the different cycles. Then we can also think within this around social determinants of health, so things like housing and income and employment and how that will impact the physiological. The next part is then the psychological components and the psychological impacts on perception. So mood and perceptions of ourself, our perceptions of others, our self-attitude, our attitudes around disclosure. So the psychological impacts, maybe in many folks, mental health challenges, think of things like the pandemic. So the psychological impacts, and then the next one is the social influences on perception. So power is a part of that, position in an organization. I often think about the difference between being a coach. I've often coached many sports, and I've also played sports where I've been coached. And I've worked with different folks that may be in certain positions, so there's that influence of power and position in an organization and how we communicate with different people. So there's the social influences. And then also linked into that are the cultural impacts. And that can be bigger, broader cultures of countries or nations or provinces or communities or an indigenous nation, or it can also be a workplace culture or a subculture. So those also have a huge influence and an impact on our perceptions. And so each of these are also impacted by the systems and structures, like we were just saying, like I was saying in the earlier videos. And so our citizenship, immigration status, the various institutions in which we interact with, healthcare, education, the institution of family, the institution of marriage, all of these will have an interplay and an impact on our influences and how we perceive certain things. So there's some common tendencies in perception, and these are generalized, and there are more. Always interested to hear from folks if you feel I may have missed some in here. A common notion that we judge others based on their actions and behaviors, things that they say, and yet we judge and evaluate ourselves based on our thoughts. And this creates an imbalance in interaction, and often many of us, I know I'm guilty of this, have self-confirmation bias, where we have a bias and are probably more gentle with ourselves than we are with other people, and that certainly impacts and influences our perception. So another really critical part is expectations. And often there's a saying around, well, don't be attached to the outcome. Having an expectation around certain things and trying to keep those in check and trying to keep those in balance. But we all have expectations. So for example, you're meeting a new person or you're interacting with a new colleague, and maybe a friend or a trusted colleague has already said something to you which influences how you're going to potentially perceive that individual, which is also another direct common tendency in perception, is that we do rely a lot on our first impressions. And sometimes it can be hard to shift, and absolutely people do shift over time. But if we've already been influenced and then meet somebody, the impressions, our first impressions, may have a lot of impact over time on our perceptions of that individual. Oftentimes we're influenced by the obvious. So, for example, being upset with a boss, but not necessarily understanding or appreciating that there may be factors and challenges beyond them that have caused them to deal with you in a certain way. And again, that's starting to think about people that we interact with who may be influenced, and their perceptions may be influenced by the systems and the structures in which they are subject to or influenced by. So those can have a key impact on perceptions. And there's another one in here where we tend to, and I know I'm guilty of this, sometimes react more to negative information than positive information. We can read many, many positive stories in the media. Not there's that many, but we may interact with social media and see the positive stories, but it's the negative ones that tend to have more of an impact. And that influences our perceptions, especially in interpersonal communication. And the last one in here is that oftentimes we assume that others like us or others are like us. And I've navigated this even in my own household, and this can happen with things like jokes or certain perceptions of things. We assume that the person that we interact with on a regular basis thinks similarly to us, is in common with us, and oftentimes they're not. And that's where the root of some conflict comes from. So those are the common tendencies that tend to impact perception. And then one of the processes that's critical in communication is being able to check our perceptions. And this is something that I know I can always improve on, is checking in about my perceptions, about my assumptions. And this is where things like empathy and humility come into play, being open-minded, being willing to accept that the person across from us and how they're feeling is an accurate representation, as opposed to filtering it through our various bias and perceptions of certain things, and being open-minded to those types of things, especially if somebody is calling us on something around behavior and maybe they feel that we acted in a way which was a microaggression. And often there's a tendency for folks to get defensive about these types of things. And so in being empathetic and open-minded, there's a certain need for some imagination and being willing to shift the narrative, going back to those ideas around the narrative. I have one, you have one, we all have them. They can shift, but often we're pretty attached to our own narratives. And so often in many conflict scenarios that may be about bigger systemic or structural components, they get reduced into the interpersonal. So say, for example, someone's raising an issue around structural racism or systemic sexism or those types of components. And I've seen this play out in a lot of different places where someone may raise something and say, well, that I feel is a racist policy, or that this was racist. And there's a knee-jerk reaction from someone who says, well, no, I'm not. And it becomes I know I'm not, yes, you are, interpersonal conflict. And the original issue, which was on the table for discussion, is lost because it's now become and reduced down into an interpersonal conflict, when it was actually talking about those bigger systems and those bigger structures was where the tension was within that discussion. And then it reduces down into being tension and conflict between two people or a group of people. So that's the pieces around perception that I think and feel that it's critical to start thinking about the bigger systems and the bigger structures and taking those into consideration, because it may very well be in a healthcare interaction in that institution or in an education setting that there are bigger systemic and structural pieces that are influencing and impacting people's perceptions, the people across from us, the people we may be in conflict with or not. And being able to start to bring some awareness to those different components can bring us to probably a little bit more common ground. And so perceptions are just at the absolute heart of communication, both our perceptions and others' perceptions, and then being able to explore those in a good way through respectful communication is an absolutely critical component. And so there are more things to explore within the others circle in this model of respectful communication, and I'll explore those in other videos. I'm curious what you're thinking about these and what you think about perceptions, and are there components to be added in here? Did this influence or impact you in some way? Did you have hey, I didn't think about it that way before? Or is this all old hat? Have you covered this in other courses? Really interested in people's thoughts, want some feedback, the positive, the negative, the critical. As long as it comes in respectful, I'm open to hearing it.